That night, everything changed. The woman I trusted, the one I gave everything to, was a stranger in my own home. Her eyes, once filled with love, now hid secrets I was too blind to see. That Valentine's night was the beginning of the end. I felt the sting of betrayal, the icy grip of rage. And I knew, in that moment, there was no turning back. I had lost her, but what I lost in love, I found in vengeance. Kyle Whitley could feel the effects of the drinks he had. He was not fully drunk yet, but he was getting there. He had trouble opening the sliding door that led to Paul and Anne's backyard deck. The deck was strong and well made, just finished recently. Earlier in the evening, Kyle thought about building a similar one to replace his back porch. Paul mentioned it took him only 4 weekends to complete the project. As Kyle tried to step outside, he stumbled a little. It was February, Valentine's Day. Even in South Texas, the evenings were chilly, and Kyle hoped the fresh air would help clear his mind. He thought the party would go on for a few more hours, giving him enough time to get sober before he and his wife, Peggy, went home. Kyle held a nearly full glass of Jack and Coke in his right hand. He didn't want to leave it behind, though he couldn't quite remember why. He chuckled to himself, deciding not to waste the drink. After finally getting through the door, he made his way to the far right corner of the deck and leaned on the railing, enjoying the cool breeze. After a while, his back started to hurt, so he stood up straight and stretched to relieve some tension. The deck was only a couple of feet above the ground, providing a slight feeling of height without any real danger. Kyle accidentally bumped the railing with his stomach, making a loud noise that surprised him. He felt a bit embarrassed, but quickly shook it off, letting the breeze take away any awkwardness. He settled back into a relaxed position, stretching his arms above his head and enjoying the peaceful night air. Almost instantly, a sense of warmth and comfort wrapped around him. He wasn't sure if the sounds of happiness came from him or somewhere else, but it felt nice. He thought he might find Peggy nearby. Peggy was someone he loved dearly, and their shared experiences had brought them closer over time. He smiled to himself, remembering the laughter and joy from their early days together. Peggy's kindness brought him so much happiness. He felt grateful for how she expressed her love and care. They had a special connection that he truly appreciated. "Oh, Peggy," he said softly, enjoying the moment they shared. She replied playfully. Kyle noticed that Anne was late. Not by much, just about 10 minutes. But it felt like a long time for him. He had been waiting inside the cafe where they planned to meet, tapping his fingers on the table as he wondered if she would show up. They had only been meeting for a couple of weeks, and he was unsure of how she felt about their secret meetings. If he was feeling nervous, he guessed she might be too. They both had a lot on the line and didn't know how to talk about it. It felt uncertain, but they really wanted to see each other. When she finally arrived, she was a bit breathless but clearly excited to see him. She greeted him warmly and they exchanged friendly gestures. Being in a public space made them both feel a little uneasy since they were not used to showing affection openly. Anne animatedly talked about dinner options while showing the menu on the table. After thinking about their choices, they picked one that caught their interest. As they finished the last bites of their meal, an awkward tension filled the air. Neither wanted to mention the real reason for their meeting that evening. The mood had changed, and it was harder to ignore the seriousness of their situation. "Anne," Kyle said gently, "we need to talk about this. We can't keep going on like this. Sooner or later, someone will find out. If they find out on their own, things will just get worse," he added, looking down into his coffee cup, wishing it could offer him a solution to the tricky situation with his best friend's wife. "I know," Anne said hesitantly. "I feel guilty all the time, and I think Paul can see it in my face. I can't even look him in the eye." Kyle nodded. He felt the same sadness when he was with his wife, Peggy. Then he shook his head. "You don't need to feel guilty, Anne," he said, a bit more firmly than he intended. "We didn't mean for this to happen. What happened just happened. It's not anyone's fault." Tears began to roll down Anne's cheeks. She dabbed a tissue at her eyes, trying to stop the flow. "It's just that Paul will be so hurt," Anne said. "I can't face that." Kyle gently held her wrists and pressed her hands together on the table. "Listen," he said softly. "He'll be even more hurt if we don't tell him. Sooner or later, he and Peggy will notice something is wrong, and then it will look like we were hiding it. You know that," he added in a comforting tone. "We just have to do it and hope they understand. There's no other way." He released her wrists and gave her hands a reassuring pat. The touch seemed to bring her some comfort and gave her a bit of strength. She sat up straighter and nodded in agreement. She bit her lip for a moment, then took a deep breath and let it out. Her head lifted, her eyes met his, and a small smile appeared on her face. But suddenly her expression changed, and she became very pale. "Paul!" she exclaimed. Kyle turned in his seat to see his friend standing close by. He and Anne had been so focused on their conversation that they hadn't noticed him enter the cafe or walk up to them. Kyle looked closely at Paul. Paul didn't seem well. He was dressed casually, but he looked a bit messy. Worry was clear on his face. His skin was pale, just like Anne's, and Kyle thought it might be the same for him. The mood had become serious, and they needed to talk to her husband about what had happened. "Anne, please, Anne, I need to know what's going on," Paul said, his voice shaky. Anne's tears flowed more freely now. She reached out to her husband, silently asking him to come closer. He did, awkwardly settling next to her. He held her as she rested her head on his shoulder, whispering soft words meant to comfort. It took some time before Anne was able to sit up straight again. Kyle stayed quiet, focusing on the table to give his friend some space. He busied himself with organizing some papers. Paul watched him, curiosity growing, but his gaze landed on the top leaflet before he spoke. "My birthday," he said, puzzled. "Is that what this is about? You're planning a surprise party?" The colorful pages showed an invitation for Paul Anderson's birthday celebration. Paul's expression lit up briefly, but it dimmed again when Kyle shook his head. Kyle looked at Anne, encouraging her to get ready for what was next. "Well, we are, but that's just part of why we've been spending so much time together," Kyle said. "Anne, we need to tell him," he added slowly. She nodded, letting out a sigh. Kyle turned his gaze back to Paul. "Paul," Kyle said gently, "we need to share something with you that might be hard to hear. I'm not sure how to say it, so please let Anne and me speak first, and then you can react however you want, okay?" Paul, looking suspicious, nodded slowly. Kyle took a deep breath and began. "That's all there is to it?" Paul asked, impatience creeping into his voice. He glanced at Anne. She nodded. "So you're saying this all started at the Valentine's Day party? How did that happen?" "It was dark, honey," Anne explained calmly. She was repeating things she had already said, but it was important her husband understood. "I heard a noise that made me think it was you after you had a few drinks. I didn't even stop to think it could be someone else. It wasn't until he called me Peggy that I realized what was going on, and I stopped right there." "So this whole thing started because of a mistake? Is that what you're saying?" Paul asked, sounding sarcastic and tense. Anne looked deeply into his eyes and noticed something there. She gently nudged him. "Come on, Paul Anderson," she said, a bit annoyed. "This isn't funny at all." Paul had a small smile on his face anyway. As the tension eased around the table, she and Kyle soon joined in, smiling widely, and all three laughed a little while later. It took them a few minutes to settle down completely. Paul, I'm really sorry this happened," Kyle said earnestly. "I wish it hadn't happened, but Anne, Paul waved his hand, brushing off his friend's worry. "I know you didn't mean it," Paul replied. "I can see it on your faces. Plus, I know Anne has been with other people," he said, trying to be gentle. "She was divorced when I met her," he added. "I'm not too upset about that part, but I am frustrated with what you two put me through in the last 2 weeks." Kyle and Anne exchanged guilty looks. "If you had just come to me right away," Paul said, "I wouldn't have lost so much sleep and would be a lot less stressed. Why didn't you just tell me?" He looked from one to the other. Kyle squirmed a bit. "Peggy," he said quietly. "Once we told you, we'd have to tell Peggy." "Oh," Paul replied. The three of them stared at each other sadly. It wasn't that Peggy Whitley was a bad person. In fact, she was the first to help a kid with a scraped knee. She'd drop by with soup if someone was sick, and she was always generous with charity. It wasn't about that. It was just, well, Her mother was one of the early feminists. Kyle often wondered how that belief matched with the reality of being married to a successful man. They had 5 children, too. He was curious how that fit with her mother's ideas. Early in his marriage, Kyle bravely asked Dan, his father-in-law, about it. Dan told him honestly that he mostly ignored what Kyle's mother-in-law said when she talked about her beliefs. He explained that he followed a more traditional approach, letting her handle the home and supporting her decisions without much comment. Besides that, he mentioned they made compromises, or at times he encouraged Denise to think differently. Kyle found that impressive. He also wondered if Denise understood the irony of how her husband handled her views, or if she even noticed. A few times, Denise had said hurtful things about men in general, and Kyle in particular during family meals. Dan would step in firmly, telling her that those comments were inappropriate and needed to stop. Denise looked a bit lost, as if she were thinking hard about what she said, or perhaps checking some kind of rule about what comments were okay to make. Each time she told Kyle she was sorry, and they moved on. Peggy had inherited her mother's strict view of some men's behaviors. This attitude lasted even through her marriage, where they raised 2 great kids, but it made their relationship tough at times. Still, she would often return to being the person Kyle fell in love with. Recently, though, it took them longer to get past their arguments. She was quite competitive, too. For example, even though she was small in stature, it frustrated her when Kyle could easily open a pickle jar she struggled with all day. In other words, she wanted to be equal to Kyle, who often jokingly played the typical male role in their relationship. Sometimes this meant she had to sit through sports shows she wasn't interested in, while Kyle would watch movies like Steel Magnolias, which Peggy liked. The last time they watched that movie, Kyle's boredom was clear. Eventually, he started to snore lightly, which made it hard for Peggy to keep watching. She playfully nudged him awake and made a few jokes. After a while, she decided to go to bed, suggesting that he might like to sleep on the couch instead. Comfortable where he was, Kyle just nodded and fell back asleep before Peggy got upstairs. She would remind him of that night for a while, but she never insisted on watching the movie again. Sometimes, Peggy's way of thinking led to bigger arguments. For example, there was the time Kyle found out Peggy hadn't been completely honest about where she was when someone bumped into their car. She had gone to the mall to buy a new dress, not to the grocery store as she had said. They really couldn't afford the dress at that moment, but she was worried it would sell out. Kyle had a hunch something was off about her story, noticing her strange behavior. When the police report contradicted what she said, he asked her some straight questions. He was not ready for the strong reactions he got in return. When he told her he felt unfairly treated and responded to her comments, Peggy decided to stay quiet for 2 weeks. Her silence didn't stop Kyle, who mentioned the incident whenever he could. He pointed out that she wouldn't have been in that mess if she hadn't done what she promised not to do. Sticking to her decision to stay quiet, Peggy didn't feel like explaining. The quiet between them just made her more annoyed, especially since she couldn't really argue with his point. When Kyle called her out for saying she hated liars, he put himself on the receiving end of another 2 weeks of her silence. She returned the dress, but Kyle had already set it aside to buy for her later when things were better. He even ate simple lunches for 2 months to save up for it, hoping it would be a way to make peace. But Peggy was upset because she wanted to earn it herself. The dress ended up forgotten in the back of her closet. They usually got along, but sometimes their arguments were too much for Kyle to handle. He loved her and wanted to spend his life with her, but there were times when her actions were really hard for him to accept. They had broken up twice, once for 3 weeks and another time for 2 months. The second time was especially tough for Peggy because she had to admit she was wrong about a credit card bill, thinking he had bought something for someone else. But the bill was for her sister's birthday, and the flowers they had sent together. She had simply forgotten. This happened a few months after their baby, Todd, was born, and eventually, things got better. The reason they didn't discuss it was not because Peggy was unkind. She just wasn't willing to give Kyle any room. They tried to hold off telling her about the mix-up for as long as they could. "Peggy," Kyle said softly, "Anne and I need to talk about something from the Valentine's Day party." He sat next to Peggy on the couch while Anne settled into the recliner. He reached for her hand, but Peggy pulled back. "What is it, dear?" Peggy asked sweetly. "It's not about the party for Paul, is it?" Kyle shook his head, feeling his irritation build as Peggy turned away. He had already said it was about the February party, but she seemed distant. He could feel tension in his jaw. He wanted to handle this carefully, but past frustrations were weighing him down as he tried to find the right words. Sharing a problem shouldn't be this hard. He wished he could trust that she would listen to him. "Would you like some more coffee?" Peggy asked Anne kindly. Anne put her hand over her nearly full cup. "No, thanks. I'm good," Anne replied, then looked at Kyle with a question on her face. "Do you want to go first, Kyle?" she asked. "You went first with Paul," she added. Peggy looked back and forth between them, suspicion starting to show on her face. "What's going on?" she asked warily. "Kyle, what did you do?" The doubt and accusation were clear in her voice. Kyle shook his head at Anne's suggestion and faced Peggy directly. Anne and I, we made a mistake at the Valentine's Day party," he said with a rough voice. He took a deep breath and started over. Peggy narrowed her eyes as he quickly explained how he had stepped out onto the back deck at Anne and Paul's house while she was outside. He talked about how he had bumped into the railing, which led to a misunderstanding. Peggy politely led Anne to the front door, thanking her for talking about the issue. She smiled, but her smile was only for Anne. She wouldn't look at Kyle. Once the door was closed, Peggy turned around and gave him a sharp tap on the arm. He jumped back, surprised, and watched her nervously. "You think you can just let this happen and not face the consequences?" she shouted, her anger clear. Kyle looked at her in shock. His wife had been angry before, but this was different. He had never seen her this upset. He narrowed his eyes, feeling overwhelmed by her rage. "Don't you dare," she started, but Kyle pointed toward the hallway where their 5-year-old daughter Megan and 3-year-old son Todd were watching with worried faces. Peggy quickly turned to them, shifting from an angry figure to a caring mother, hugging her children and telling them that everything would be all right, all while giving Kyle a stern look over their heads. Things were not all right, and Kyle felt it deep inside. He sensed that something important had been broken today. He had hoped they could fix their problems, but now he realized that their marriage was in trouble. He turned away from Peggy's glare and walked into the kitchen to get a bottle of water, trying to calm his dry throat. "I'm going to get even with you," Peggy said quietly as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table. He was having his second cup of coffee after dinner while reading the latest ESPN magazine. Lately, he had started bringing something to read to fill the silence that had taken over since her outburst. "What?" Kyle said sharply. This was the first time in weeks Peggy had spoken to him directly about anything other than basic needs. He wasn't ready for her to break her silence. "I'm going to get even for letting Anne get too close," she said with a challenging look. "Did you think I would just let that happen?" "Peggy," Kyle said tiredly, "it wasn't on purpose. When Anne and I realized we were in the wrong place, we pulled back immediately. I told you it was a mistake, and Anne has said the same thing. Everyone involved except you understands that. Don't you think it's time to move on?" "No way," Peggy replied sharply. "You had your fun, now it's my turn," she said with determination. Kyle shook his head, feeling hopeless as he tried to explain to his wife that nothing wrong had happened. "That's a really grown-up attitude," he said with a hint of sarcasm. Peggy's eyes narrowed, and her fingers twisted together as she fumed, her face showing how upset she was. "I'll get my revenge. I know you wanted to enjoy yourself that night. You'll regret it, Kyle Whitley. You will." Kyle looked at Peggy, trying to find the right words. "Peggy," he said softly, "would you consider going to couples counseling with me? Maybe we can sort things out with someone who can help us. Will you think about it?" Peggy shook her head before he could finish. He pressed on. "I don't need to talk to someone who's only going to tell me I'm wrong," she replied sharply. "You can choose the counselor," Kyle suggested. "Pick anyone you prefer. I'll go with you, anywhere, anytime." But Peggy turned her head violently, refusing his offer. Kyle felt defeated. It was a lost cause. "Fine," he said firmly. "Whatever." He added, "Maybe you could think about some counseling for yourself. If you don't find a way to handle that anger, it could end up hurting you." Kyle picked up his magazine again after a pause. Peggy's face was flushed with new emotion as she glared at him, then got up and walked out of the room with stiff movements. Kyle shook his head and watched her leave, lowering the magazine. Ever since he and Anne had confessed their mistake to Peggy, the bond between him and his wife had faded. There was little affection left, and basic politeness had vanished. Kyle fell into a pattern of being alone, finding comfort in his own company. He didn't like it, but he felt it wasn't his place to push for change. Surprisingly, a few days later, things began to shift after Kyle had mentioned counseling. Dinner that Thursday was much brighter than it had been in weeks. Peggy eagerly shared updates from her work and talked about Mandy and her husband Bill, part of the social group they had for barbecues and parties. Peggy was close to Mandy, as their desks were just a few cubicles apart. Though older than most in the group, Mandy and Bill looked vibrant and energetic. They had just learned they would be grandparents again. Peggy excitedly wondered if the new baby would be a girl, her joy clear and unmistakable. Kyle watched Peggy move around the kitchen, noticing how much happier she seemed since breakfast. After putting the kids to bed, Kyle and Peggy settled on the couch to watch the latest episode of American Idol. He was unsure what to make of her change in mood, but decided to enjoy the peaceful atmosphere. Their earlier arguments had worn them out. Maybe things were getting better. When the show finished, Peggy smiled at him and reached out gently. "I'm sorry, honey," she said softly. "I've been difficult these past few weeks, and I see now how it has affected you." Kyle was surprised by her words. They felt important. "Well, it takes both of us to work through this," he replied after a moment. "I'm sorry, too." She smiled wider and leaned closer, which felt comforting. "I know," she said thoughtfully, "but if I hadn't been so hard on myself about everything, maybe we could have had more happy times." She laughed lightly, a sweet sound that showed a side of her he rarely saw. It made him feel hopeful. He murmured, enjoying this moment of connection. "I've missed this," he added. "Would you like to come upstairs with me?" She laughed playfully, took his hands, and led him up beside her. She wrapped her arms around his neck in a warm hug. They walked up the stairs, chuckling softly. Kyle started to unbutton his shirt, feeling the warmth of the moment. Peggy had her dress partly unzipped by the time they reached the second floor. When they got to their bedroom, they quickly closed the door behind them. After checking that the door was locked, Kyle joined Peggy by the bed, both still feeling light-hearted from the evening. They shared a tender moment, enjoying being together. Their laughter filled the room as they continued to show their affection for one another. He tried to move closer to Peggy, but it was tough. After a moment, he let her take the lead. They were both caught up in a moment of deep connection, feeling a longing that had been building for a while. This moment felt brief, but Peggy's excitement was clear as she focused on the feelings they were sharing, embracing the warmth around them. After a few moments, she lay down beside Kyle, taking a deep breath. They enjoyed a quiet moment, happy in the closeness they had found. They stayed together, sharing the warmth and bond between them. With a soft smile, Peggy rested by his side, her breathing slowly calming as they both enjoyed the comfort of being together. He tried to hold back, but her gentle touch was hard to resist. A moment later, familiar feelings told him he was about to reach an important point. "Peggy!" he warned. Her movements sped up as she kept a steady pace, clearly trying to make things more intense for him. Suddenly, he couldn't hold back any longer. A wave of relief washed over him, leaving him surprised yet satisfied. Peggy observed him with interest, clearly enjoying the moment. Leaning closer, she focused on him, wanting to see the peak of their experience. When it passed, she playfully waved her hand, her face showing the fun they shared. Even though he couldn't see everything clearly, he appreciated her joy. "I hope you know I wouldn't really try to get back at you," Peggy said gently. Kyle mumbled something comforting, patting her shoulder. They had spent a relaxed time together after their close moment. Though Kyle wanted to keep their bond strong, Peggy felt tired after a long day and suggested they could enjoy more time together on the weekend. He agreed, but not without hesitation. "I mean, it just wouldn't feel right," she added sleepily. "I just couldn't." Kyle turned to face her, and they found comfort in each other's presence, savoring the calm after their connection. At that moment, he felt thankful that the tough times were behind them and appreciated how Peggy had softened her viewpoint about his past. It reminded him of earlier days in their marriage when she had let go of something she wanted but felt she couldn't have. She had said buying it would be the wrong thing to do. He closed his eyes, feeling tired. Nothing had truly changed. Peggy had only changed her approach. The frustration he had seen in her eyes days earlier was still there just beneath the surface. She had simply hidden her feelings a little to catch him off guard, and maybe the strain of their situation weighed on her too. He felt exhausted. He slept but did not wake refreshed. He couldn't let his thoughts keep circling. Confrontation wasn't his favorite, yet he always tried to be honest. "Are you going shopping at the mall today?" Kyle asked Peggy, a hint of sarcasm in his voice. She was about to open the front door, and it was 7:30. If traffic was heavy, she would barely make it to work on time. "Well, no, I hadn't planned on it," she answered. "Why? Is there something you need?" She looked at Kyle curiously. He took a bite of the toaster pastry and swallowed before responding. "No, I was just thinking about something," Kyle said. "The last time you told me you wouldn't do something because it was the wrong choice, something unfortunate happened in the parking lot of the Prairie View Mall." Peggy's forehead creased, then her jaw tightened. A flicker of anger lit up her eyes as she realized what he meant. She stayed quiet for a moment, letting out a big sigh. Kyle could see in her eyes that all her hard work in the past few days felt undone. "Payback takes time, Kyle Aaron Whitley," she said softly. The calm tone of her voice made her frustration clear. "I will find a way to deal with what you've done. I promise you, dear husband, I will get closure before I can move on." With that, Peggy opened the door and stepped outside quickly, shutting it firmly behind her. Kyle stood in silence, watching the door to see if his wife would come back to talk more. He felt a strong wave of worry. Peggy would not let this go. She wouldn't forgive him. She wouldn't agree to a break. She disliked the two they had already, so they could have some space. She had turned down counseling and seemed determined to seek justice for what she saw as his betrayal. He didn't know what he could do to help her forgive and move forward. He just didn't know. Things slowly started to get better. There wasn't much closeness, but Kyle and Peggy found ways to be kinder to each other. They couldn't completely hide the tension between them, though. Their 3-year-old son, Todd, began having accidents at night again. Both parents thought it was because of the stress Todd could sense but didn't really understand between them. Kyle and Peggy found ways to cooperate and act cheerful in front of their children. They kept their disagreements quieter and away from the kids. Todd's accidents became less frequent, but they still happened. The issue surrounding the mistake on Valentine's Day that Peggy firmly considered Kyle's fault remained unresolved. One day, Megan saw a commercial on TV. She didn't understand what they were advertising, but she was intrigued by a little boy who heard his dad say he would miss him while he was away. The boy quickly filled his dad's suitcase with every picture of himself he could find to send with his father on his trip. Megan wanted to do the same. When Kyle found her, Megan had 2 photo albums ready, filled with pictures of her and her little brother from their earliest days, along with several framed photos of the 2 kids. Kyle smiled, immediately recognizing what his little girl was doing. He explained to her that it was a wonderful idea, but all those pictures would be too heavy for her mother to carry. The little girl understood heavy. For her slender frame, almost everything felt too heavy to lift. She quickly let go of her wish for her mom to take all the pictures with her. Instead, they agreed to have one framed 8x10 picture of each child. Kyle held the picture of Todd while he opened one of Peggy's bags. Megan insisted that her picture go into the larger bag already packed on the bed. Kyle couldn't find a reason to object, even though he would have put them both in one case if it were up to him. He unzipped both bags to include the photos in his wife's luggage. He moved some clothes around to find a spot to keep the glass front of the picture safe. As he shifted delicate items back into place, a thought crossed his mind. He looked closer. The suitcase had an array of Peggy's clothing, neatly folded and arranged in stacks. There were several pairs of stylish items and various accessories filling the case. Feeling a bit curious, he unzipped the garment bag hanging on the closet door and found several nice dresses and business outfits inside. In a small overnight bag, he discovered Peggy's makeup and a jewelry case with her best necklace, one she rarely wore, but he thought it looked beautiful on her. In one corner of the jewelry case, there was a small plastic bag tucked away. "Mommy, Mommy, come and see what I did!" Megan called as she ran downstairs. "I put my and Todd's pictures in your suitcase," she said proudly. Kyle could hear her voice even from upstairs in the bedroom. He stood and walked to the dresser. There was an easy chair against the wall, and he sat down, waiting for his wife to come in. He could hear Peggy approaching, her voice sounding a bit worried as she scolded Megan for touching her bags. When Peggy entered the bedroom, she didn't see Kyle at first. He stayed still, partially hidden by the dresser. Peggy's tone softened when she noticed her husband wasn't next to the open luggage. "Can you explain this, Peggy?" Kyle asked quietly. Peggy flinched at his voice and turned to him, looking tense and pale. A hint of defiance crossed her face. "Explain what?" she replied, stalling. Kyle showed his annoyance. He noticed Megan just inside the door but decided to stay quiet. Carefully, he placed Megan's picture in the middle of Peggy's neatly folded clothes and zipped the bag up. "There," he said with a certain flair. "Megan, your and Todd's pictures are going with your mom on her trip," he assured her. With a happy grin, Megan dashed out of the room, eager to tell her brother what she had done, always in a rush. Kyle stood back and looked at his wife. She felt like someone he was drifting away from. He hoped someone would help them connect so they could move forward in their lives. "What's happening, Peggy?" he asked. Peggy remembered what her mother had taught her. Sometimes it's better to be ready for anything. She tried to keep that in mind. "Nothing's happening," she replied firmly. "Why are you asking all these questions?" "Peggy, you have all your nice clothes packed, along with your jewelry and several pairs of shoes. You usually just take a simple outfit when you travel. You're ready for more than just regular work meetings, aren't you?" Kyle noted. Before he finished, Peggy began shaking her head. "No, that's not what I'm thinking," she shot back. "Look, if you haven't noticed, I'm getting a promotion at work. I need to be ready for special events, and I need to look professional. That's part of moving up in my career." Her tone was assertive. She thought she had a strong point. "And I wanted to pack some of my nicer sleepwear. Well, I don't know. I just did," she added. Kyle didn't ask about the items. He picked up a plastic bag from the dresser and opened it carefully. He set a small pack on the bed in front of her. Peggy's eyes followed it, and when it landed, she recognized it, and her face turned red. I don't know where that came from," she stammered, feeling unsure as she spoke. Kyle held up 2 papers and pretended to read them. "Well, the receipt is from yesterday, my dear, and this copy shows our credit card number," he said coldly. Peggy sank down next to her bags. "Kyle," she whispered, "you have to see it from my side. Please." Kyle was surprised by her request. She wanted him to understand why she felt hurt. "I just want to feel equal again. I want us to work together and move past this," she said softly. She was looking for understanding. He thought only her mother might truly understand Peggy's feelings. He shook his head. "Peggy, what happened with Anne was an accident. We never meant to hurt you or Paul. It was a mistake. If you choose to pursue someone else to get back at me, you would be crossing a line that could really damage our marriage." "Would you want to end things between us like that? Do you really want a divorce?" Kyle asked seriously. Peggy's expression changed. "No," she said firmly, "I do not want a divorce. I just want us to be equal in our marriage, Kyle. We need to share everything fairly, or I might think about ending things. Do you get that?" "Sure," Kyle replied. "You did something in the parking lot that wasn't right, and I did something wrong at Ann and Paul's place. So, we're even now, right?" His voice was filled with sarcasm. Peggy gave him an angry look. "That's not the same, and you know it," she said firmly. "Okay, you're right," Kyle shot back. "When you bought something we couldn't afford, you hid it from me. You said you wouldn't buy it, but then you did. That's the real issue. You didn't tell me the truth. I haven't done that. I haven't lied to you about anything. Anne and I were honest about what happened. I could have been really upset about the dress and the accident, especially since it affects our insurance. What should I do now?" "I returned the dress," Peggy replied softly. Kyle scoffed. "The damage to my trust in the car is already done, Peggy. I'll ask again. What should I do about this?" He watched as Peggy shook her head, looking confused and emotional. Kyle felt defeated. With her mother's advice in her mind, Peggy couldn't answer him, feeling trapped. "Yeah, well, I don't know either," he said sadly. "Do you want a divorce?" he asked. "I'd get it if you did," he added. Peggy shook her head again, her eyes filling with tears. He couldn't tell if she was upset or scared about the idea of a divorce. "If that's the case," he said, "I won't let anything happen that leads us to a divorce. I won't let you go to Chicago and look for support elsewhere, do you understand?" He felt he needed to say it, but it might have been a mistake. While he spoke, Peggy quickly collected her thoughts, eager to defend herself. She pushed aside any signs of the things he had discovered and focused on their argument. Although she wanted to tell the truth, she held back. Instead, Peggy said she had gotten the items for a friend, Linda, who needed them for her own use. She explained that her busy day made her forget to drop them off. It was just a small mistake, and Kyle shouldn't be so upset about it. Kyle didn't buy her explanation, aware it seemed flawed. He had heard similar stories before and felt more uneasy about their situation. Still, he decided to stay quiet, struggling with the reality of Peggy's growing dishonesty. Seeing the doubt on Kyle's face only made Peggy more frustrated. She began to argue with him, bringing up Anne again but insisting she wasn't seeking revenge. "All right," she said. She took several things from the suitcase and put them back in the drawers of her dresser. A few dresses went back into the closet. She wanted to show Kyle that she was not up to anything unexpected. When she finished, everything fit nicely into the largest suitcase and the garment bag. She added a pantsuit that she hadn't been able to pack before. "You know I'll see any purchases you make in Chicago on the credit card or bank statements," he said softly. Peggy's face changed as she realized he understood her plans. "You're going to regret the day." Peggy stopped herself from saying more. She packed her nightshirt into the case and zipped it up tightly. Stepping around Kyle, she carried the heavy bag out of the bedroom and set it down near the stairs. She knew it would be hard to carry it all at once. Without looking back, she walked down the stairs with determination. "Brad! How's it going, buddy?" Kyle greeted one of his oldest friends as he entered the garage to make a call. He wanted to keep the conversation away from Peggy. It might only cause more problems. "Good. Good. How about you, big guy?" Brad responded cheerfully. He had reason to feel good. He had built a law practice from the ground up, and it was now successful with many partners and staff. "I'm doing pretty well," Kyle said. "Not as well as some, but better than others." Brad laughed. Kyle never aimed to get rich, but he owned the local Fox TV station, a radio station, and had options on a couple more TV stations. While a big part of his income came from his late father's trust, he had managed it wisely. Brad was doing even better, but they both took pride in their achievements, and most importantly, they had kept their close friendship since elementary school. Kyle wasn't Brad's biggest client, but he was still important to him. Their friendship grew deeper during their school sports years when they supported each other. That was a long time ago, but they still remained a strong team. Each held secrets about the other that no one else knew. "We need to get together for a nice meal," Brad suggested. "How about you and Peggy come over for a barbecue on Sunday?" Kyle hesitated. "Well, I'm not sure that's the best idea," Kyle replied slowly. "I'm calling you because there's something about Peggy that I need to discuss." Brad quickly switched gears, ready to help his friend. "I'm sorry to hear that," Brad said with concern. "What can I do for you, number 42? That was Kyle's old jersey number. It reminded Kyle of their many years of friendship. It felt comforting. "Well, it's not at the point where I need to hire you for a divorce. Not yet," Kyle said. "But I was hoping I could ask you for a favor if that's okay." "Go ahead," Brad said simply. "You're friends with Jake Bruckmeister, right?" Kyle asked. Jake's firm was where Peggy worked as a senior analyst. "Yeah," Brad replied. "He was a good friend of my dad's. His granddaughter helps out in my office during her summer breaks from law school." "Well, I was wondering if you could call him and share a concern I have. It seems that the rules in his firm about employee conduct aren't being enforced as strongly as they should be." Kyle was careful with his words, hoping to express his thoughts clearly. "If you mention that I have some solid information about Peggy and a coworker from the Chicago conference, it might make them think about the company's rules and how effective they are. They really should pay attention to this." Got it, Brad said quickly. When does Peggy leave? 3 hours, Kyle answered. That's plenty of time, Brad said. You don't want her to go? Nope, Kyle replied. She has some things packed that make it seem like she wants to get back at me for that problem with Ann Blakely I mentioned. You remember? Yeah, I get it, Brad said. I'll make the call after we hang up. I'll try to keep your name out of it, but be ready for some consequences. Kyle hadn't thought about that. He had been concentrating on saving his marriage. He hadn't fully accepted Peggy's growing tendency to be untruthful. It was clear she often reacted strongly under pressure. Whether she found out about Kyle's part in any of this or not, she would be upset. The thought worried him, but he was determined to keep working on the marriage. He sighed, and the sound came through the phone. Brad chuckled. Hey, thanks, Brad, Kyle said genuinely. It was time to wrap up the call and let his friend assist him as best he could. Not a problem, Brad said. This is nothing. If we have to get a divorce, we'll just call it even for when you stopped that player in the Seguin game, okay? Kyle had pulled off a key move, leaving the other player on the ground. I'd still owe you for that linebacker on the next play, though, Brad continued. The linebacker had been aiming to retaliate. When Kyle tackled him, it made for a great moment. Brad had then dodged left and sprinted down the field for a tying touchdown. Kyle laughed, the sound brightening the mood after a tough time. Okay, Kyle said. You really need to let some of those go, my friend. Not a chance, Brad responded quickly. I take looking after my health seriously. You've been a big part of that over the years, Kyle said with a laugh. He quickly changed the topic to something lighter. They chatted for a few more minutes and made plans to meet for lunch in a week or two. Kyle said he would call Brad once he figured out his schedule before wrapping up the conversation. As he walked back into the house, he thoughtfully put his phone in his right pocket. Hello? Mrs. Whitley? This is Sam McMillan, he said. Hi, Sam. What's going on? Peggy replied. Sam was her boss, a man she didn't think much of, especially since she believed she could do his job better. Junior asked me to tell you that you won't be going to Chicago to represent Bruckmeister and Son, Sam said directly. Junior was Jake Bruckmeister, Jr., who was moving up in the company and training to take over when his father retired. Right now, he led the group where Peggy worked. Everyone quickly followed Junior's orders because no one wanted to upset the future CEO. However, he usually stayed away from daily tasks, like choosing who would attend training events. Peggy felt upset about this sudden change. Are you still there, Mrs. Whitley? Sam asked. You're taking me off the trip, Peggy asked, her voice tense. Why? Is there something I missed? He asked suspiciously. No, not that I know of, Peggy replied. No one has told me anything. Sam added, but you need to come into the office tomorrow morning since you aren't going, or would you rather take some vacation time? Peggy could sense he was enjoying this. Sam didn't mind that Peggy wasn't going to the training. He imagined himself laughing quietly at the news. This just added to her frustration. In his office on the 4th floor, Sam was smiling. He felt pleased that Peggy wasn't going on the trip. She didn't realize that people had heard about her hopes for his job. Since the conference wouldn't have offered her much training, he could easily lower her performance rating due next Thursday. Okay, I'll see you tomorrow morning, Peggy said cheerfully on the phone, trying not to show how upset she was. After hanging up, she stared out the kitchen window. With her not going to the conference, she wouldn't have time to connect with Roger, the only single co-worker going to the Chicago event. Peggy had needed this training for her career growth, and now it was on hold. She was very upset. It took a week for the talk about Peggy's canceled trip to spread through the office. Some suggested it was because she had planned something with one of the men who was supposed to go. The Bruckmeisters, senior and junior, hadn't noticed the clerk picking up papers by the large file cabinets. Junior wanted to know why Peggy couldn't go to the training conference. The clerk held on to the news for a while, but eventually told it to a new secretary on the 5th floor. She spread the word quickly, though the clerk didn't get the date he wanted. At first, Peggy didn't notice the chatter. Most people in her area seemed unusually happy, but she ignored it. It wasn't until Roger Compton stopped by her desk that she started to understand what was going around. Roger came to tell her he wasn't interested in her and wouldn't be. He added that he and his girlfriend were serious about their relationship, and he wanted Peggy to back off. Peggy stood there shocked by what he said, and after he finished, she shared her frustration. She told him it was rude to think she was interested in him at all. Roger sniffed and turned away without saying anything, making Peggy even angrier. Later, Linda caught Peggy up at lunch about the rumors buzzing around the office. The three men who were supposed to travel had heard the gossip and compared notes. Since Peggy smiled at only Roger, they quickly jumped to conclusions. None of them could ask her to confirm anything, and she wouldn't, leaving everyone at Bruckmeister and Son convinced by the gossip. When Peggy got home, her simmering anger finally spilled over and she confronted Kyle. "You think you can stop me from going to Chicago?" Peggy said as he entered the house. He had picked up the kids from daycare and was smiling at something Todd said. His smile faded as he saw how she looked, and Mandy and Todd exchanged confused glances. "What's wrong?" Kyle asked. "You did something to make sure I didn't go," Peggy accused. Kyle's face stayed calm as he looked at her for a moment. "I did," he said quietly. "I knew what you were planning, and I did what I had to do to keep our marriage strong." Peggy's eyes widened in disbelief at what he said. She had expected him to deny it, and for a moment she struggled to respond. "I talked to Roger this afternoon," Kyle went on. "He called me to tell me he didn't mean to do anything with you." The news left her speechless for a moment. She started to shake with anger. The two men shouldn't have talked about her when she wasn't around. "You had no right to talk to him," she said angrily. "Who do you think you are? You can't just decide things without asking me." Kyle shook his head, looking tired after a long day at work. "That wasn't the point, Peggy. It was just two people trying to talk instead of making snap judgments." He stood up straight and rubbed his lower back. "He called me, remember? Don't blame me for what happened." "I don't believe you," Peggy replied sharply. "You got me taken off the training list, and you shouldn't have done that." Kyle's frustration was clear as he stepped back, feeling the tension between them. "Come on, kids," he said cheerfully, trying to lighten the mood. "Who wants to go to Chuck E. Cheese?" The children cheered and ran towards his truck with excitement. Once the kids were running off, Kyle leaned against the doorframe and lowered his voice to speak only to Peggy. "You need to calm down, Peggy," he said sincerely. "If you ever speak to me like that in front of the kids again, I will leave and take them with me. I won't put up with you shouting, especially around them. I'm serious, and you should really listen. This needs to change, or I will go, no question." He closed the door firmly, not gently. When Kyle and the kids came back, Peggy was waiting with a bright smile, looking happy to see them. She wore a long, cozy housecoat that smelled nice. She looked refreshed and ready to enjoy time with her family. Sitting with Mandy and Todd, she listened excitedly as they talked about their fun day and showed her the silly black-and-white photos they had taken. Peggy smiled at their stories, enjoying every moment. Kyle watched for a bit before heading upstairs for a hot shower to unwind. Afterwards, Kyle read a bedtime story to his kids, kissed them goodnight, and tucked them in carefully. He loved these peaceful moments as he watched them fall asleep. When he walked into their bedroom, he saw Peggy waiting for him. She playfully covered his eyes with her hands. "Guess who?" she said softly, not pausing for an answer. She stepped out and gave him a warm hug, her eyes sparkling as they came together. "Come here," she said, leading him to the big chair by the window and guiding him into it gently. She knelt beside him, helping him relax as they shared a comforting hug, holding each other close. They exchanged a long, warm kiss filled with care. He softly touched her back as they enjoyed being close to each other, feeling their bond grow stronger with each passing moment. After a few quiet moments, Peggy smiled and took his hand, helping him to sit back comfortably. They shared a calm silence, appreciating the peace of being together. She held him close, feeling a mix of emotions as they connected. She leaned on him for support while they shared a special moment. As they grew closer, Peggy felt warmth spreading inside her, slowly building up. She moved gently, feeling their connection strengthen with each movement. Eventually, the feeling of closeness became overwhelming for her. Overcome with emotion, Peggy rested her head on Kyle's shoulder, feeling breathless and serene. She let herself relax against him, and Kyle smiled softly, understanding the meaning of their connection. "Was it good?" he asked with a kind smile. Peggy nodded, still catching her breath and happy just to be near him. Kyle took a moment to gather himself, then stood up with Peggy in his arms. Surprised, she quickly wrapped her arms around his neck and her legs around his waist. Kyle walked slowly toward the bed, making sure to be careful with every step. When they reached it, he gently placed Peggy down on the mattress, supporting himself with one hand. Kyle smiled kindly and guided their movements softly. Peggy hesitated at first, but soon relaxed, feeling their bond deepen in this special moment. They moved gently together, filled with understanding and care, leading to a peaceful end to their time together. Kyle focused on the warmth of the moment, feeling a rush of feelings inside him. As the moment intensified, he let go of his cautious pace and moved with more urgency. Peggy sensed the change and matched his energy, their connection deepening as they moved together. The moment became more intense as they fully embraced the experience together. As their emotions peaked, Kyle felt a powerful wave of release, his body responding to the depth of their connection. Exhausted but happy, he lay down gently beside Peggy. The moment left them both feeling content, their bond growing even stronger from the time they shared together. It conveyed warmth and a desire to connect deeply with her husband. She felt a warm sense of comfort in being close to him, and their feelings grew stronger together. A gentle blush appeared on her face as they shared this moment, making their bond even deeper. Eventually, they relaxed on the bed, letting go of the intensity they had felt before. Kyle turned to lie next to Peggy, both of them breathing heavily from the emotions they had just shared. They rested together, sometimes touching each other lightly, enjoying the warmth they created between them. Time passed as they appreciated each other's company, feeling the worries of the day fade away for a while. Peggy snuggled against Kyle, her head on his shoulder, feeling safe and comfortable with him. "I'm sorry, Kyle," she said softly, trying to hide her tiredness. "I know I can be difficult sometimes, but I never mean to," she added, sounding a bit sad. In that moment, she felt more at peace with him than she had in a long time. "Peggy," he replied gently, "we need to move forward. For the kids. For our lives. We've been stuck on this for too long." His voice was calm, trying to comfort her. "I know," she said quietly. She shifted a little before settling against him again. "It's just hard to think of you with someone else, and it really hurts." Her voice was soft, looking for his support. Kyle did his best to comfort her. "I understand how you feel," he said sincerely. "The thought of you with someone else would hurt me too. I never wanted to hurt you. That was never my goal." Though she stayed close, Peggy didn't show any sign of forgiveness or resolution, and they spent the rest of the night in silence, each holding the other, each thinking about their feelings in their own way. What they had, he thought the next morning, was a truce, not a real peace. On a quiet Saturday morning at the end of August, Kyle decided to do everything he could to prevent Peggy from being tempted to leave their relationship. He made this choice after thinking about what would happen if he did nothing, knowing he could never forgive a serious act of betrayal. He had already stopped her from going to a training conference in Chicago by using his connections to get involved. Until then, he hadn't tried very hard to make her appreciate their commitment. But that changed. As he watched Mandy and Todd playing in a sandbox at the park, he realized he would do almost anything to keep his family together. If it took more effort than he expected, that was okay. There was no rule saying Peggy had to meet him halfway. If he had to make extra effort, so be it. He would work hard to keep himself, Peggy, Mandy, and Todd as a family. He had tried before, but now he would try even harder. Peggy wasn't with them at the park. She was working late at her office downtown to finish an important audit and prepare the report. He knew exactly where she was and what she was doing. This was the third Saturday in a row she had to work, and it was getting tiresome. He had an idea. "Kids! Hey, come here for a minute." The two children in the sandbox jumped up and ran to their dad at the park bench, where he had been watching them play. They had been busy for a while and were ready for something new. Kyle crouched down to talk to them quietly, as if sharing a secret. They leaned in closer, and he hugged them gently. "What do you think? We get all cleaned up and go get a big pizza?" he started, but the toddlers squealed with joy. And we take our pizza to see Mommy? They cheered and danced with excitement. It was a plan that quickly came to life. When they walked into Peggy's office at lunchtime, they were met with tired smiles from a room full of busy accountants. Kyle had expanded his idea and brought enough pizza and drinks for everyone. When the staff saw what he had done, they quickly gathered around, happily joining in the feast. The mood in the office lifted almost instantly. Everyone's expressions grew warmer, and the room filled with happiness when the little boy and girl gave their mom cards that showed how much they missed her. When Kyle took them away half an hour later, each child had received many hugs and had fun sitting on laps, playing with keyboards while they explored the computer screens. Mandy was especially taken with a game on the computer. As they left, the smiles in the office lingered into the evening. Everyone worked hard to finish the project, praising Peggy for having such a wonderful husband and family. Some of the single women wondered if Kyle had a brother who might be available. Knowing this brought a smile to Kyle's face, and he made an extra effort to show Peggy she was loved and important. It had been 10 months since a tough time had happened, and he had hoped she would begin to feel better, but it seemed to still be on her mind. He saw it as a worry that wouldn't go away, and he was doing everything he could to bring her comfort and support, hoping it would slowly fade. Kyle made it a habit to visit her office at unexpected times. Sometimes he would take her out for lunch. Other times he would bring homemade meals and spend time with her, chatting and laughing at her desk with anyone who passed by. Occasionally, he surprised her by picking her up from work and taking her to a show or another fun place before heading home. Every now and then, Peggy would get flowers or roses at work, along with a sweet card. On her birthday, her cubicle was filled with flowers, decorations, and treats. A new coworker, who had just moved from another office, noticed this and decided not to be interested in Peggy, choosing to look elsewhere. Married women in the office admired Kyle for being such a caring husband, encouraging their own partners to be more like him. The other women smiled whenever his name came up, saying how lucky Peggy was to have his support. However, not many noticed when Peggy's mood shifted during these moments. Some missed the annoyance that flickered on her face when Kyle unexpectedly showed up at her office. As time passed, a few people began to question why she seemed less happy when surprises like flowers or treats arrived. But nobody knew about what had happened 10 months earlier. Peggy kept her feelings hidden, thinking no one would really understand. "Hi, Mom," Peggy said during their regular Thursday evening call. "Hi, hun," her mom replied. "What's up? Have you talked to Kyle about how he treated you?" "No," Peggy sighed. "I doubt he ever will understand." "That's not right," Denise replied firmly. "You need to stand your ground, Peggy. You know you have to. But, Mom, every time I try to meet someone new, Kyle is always around. At work? At the tennis club? I can't seem to find a moment to breathe," Peggy said. Her mother listened sympathetically. "Is there no one else at work?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Peggy scoffed. "Kyle has all the women in the office wrapped around his finger," she complained. "If I even smile at another guy, someone will call him so quickly, he'd probably be right behind me before I could even say hello." Denise shared her daughter's frustration about feeling suffocated by her husband. She felt sad that he had won over everyone at the office, but she didn't know how to help change the situation. "Well, honey, let's think," Denise said, tapping her finger on the phone. This habit always annoyed Peggy, but she never said anything. "I guess you need to let go of the idea of a little fun for now," Denise said with a sigh. "No way," Peggy replied passionately. "Kyle did something wrong, and I want to make it right in my own way, no matter what. I am determined to find a little enjoyment in my life, period." Neither Peggy nor her mother considered the deeper meaning of their conversation. Denise didn't really want to think about what she was encouraging her daughter to do. They both knew this wasn't the best choice, but it felt like a way to get back at Kyle for how unfair he had been. "That's my girl," Denise said cheerfully. "You can't let him run your life like this. He needs to know how you've been feeling." Suddenly, a fire truck approached with a loud siren. The noise grew louder and louder until it filled the house and seemed to shake the people inside. For a few long seconds, the sound took over everything. After the truck went by, an ambulance followed, and then all the noises faded as they drove down the street. "Wow," Denise said. "For a moment, I thought that truck was right in your bedroom," she joked. "Yeah, I was wondering if it was going to come in through the window or something," Peggy laughed. "It was really loud, I can tell you that," she told her mother. "So where were we?" Denise asked. "We were talking about some things I need to discuss with my husband," Peggy reminded her. "Right," Denise said. "Listen, if you're interested, I bet there are a lot of nice guys at your father's and my country club, at Hidden Hills. If you come with me one afternoon, I could introduce you." "No, Mom," Peggy replied, sounding a bit annoyed. "I told Kyle years ago how much I hated that place. If I started going out there now, he would definitely notice." "Okay," Denise said, sounding a bit resigned. There was a short pause in their chat. "You know, I just don't get why Kyle can't see that he was wrong about that situation with Anne. You deserve to have some balance in your life. It's only fair, and he should understand that. It just doesn't make sense," she said, showing her irritation. "I know," Peggy said, "but it feels like he thinks he controls my choices. He won't let me find my own peace." "You can have peace," said a deep voice suddenly. "You just can't do things that are risky just to make a point." Kyle had walked into the room to make a phone call during the noise from the fire truck. Neither woman had noticed he was listening in. Peggy and Denise stared in surprise. "Kyle!" Peggy shouted into the phone, her voice rising. "You can't listen in when I'm talking to my mom. You have no right to invade my privacy." "I wasn't eavesdropping, Peggy," Kyle replied calmly. "I picked up the phone to call Fred about golf tomorrow. I didn't know you were talking about this until I overheard part of it. But I have to say, if there's no trust, people will start doubting each other." Frustrated, Peggy hung up the phone and let out a loud sigh. Kyle could hear the noise from downstairs, and Denise picked up on it too, even through the phone. "You have some nerve," Denise began, her voice filled with anger. "How can you talk to us like that? You don't have the right to speak to me and my daughter that way." Kyle cut her off. "I will talk to my wife how I want, Denise. It's not your place to get involved in our problems." "You have no right to come between me and my wife. It's time for you to stop." "You listen to me," Denise said sharply, her anger rising. She paused to take a deep breath, trying to steady her shaking hands. "No, you listen to me, Denise," Kyle replied firmly. "If your daughter goes through with what she's been thinking about for months, she'll lose everything she values, me, her kids, her friends, even her job. If I find out you've helped her in any way, I will take action against you." His voice grew stronger. "Do you understand? I may not know all the laws, but I'll find a way. You need to back off, Denise." His emotions had been building up after thinking about his mother-in-law's suggestions to his wife. Without waiting for a response, he hung up the phone. About 20 minutes later, while trying to calm down with a walk around the block, his phone rang. He had left the house while Peggy was still gathering her thoughts. Expecting it to be her, he was surprised to see his father-in-law's name on the screen. Nervously, he decided to answer, "Kyle?" Dan's voice was firm, and Kyle stayed quiet. "Why are you threatening my wife and yelling at her? What's happening?" "Dan, let me explain," Kyle replied calmly. "I overheard something when Peggy and Denise weren't aware. Your wife was suggesting finding someone to help Peggy as a way to get back at me for something in the past." "What?" Dan's voice was uncertain as he tried to understand. "Exactly," Kyle said. "Can you believe it? Hearing your mother-in-law suggest something like that, it's not right." "That's a serious claim, Kyle," Dan said carefully. "I don't think it's fair to say that." Both men recognized how serious the situation was, even though Dan's feelings about his wife's actions were unclear. At that moment, Dan glanced at Denise, his face serious. They exchanged looks full of tension, but Denise's expression eventually softened. She hadn't realized until now how her words to her daughter could come off that way. The disappointment in Dan's eyes caught her off guard. Suddenly she understood that she had overstepped. What had seemed like a simple suggestion to her now felt much heavier. She hadn't thought much before bringing up the men at the club. Now, she realized she had made a mistake. "Actually, it's a bit more serious than that." "Dad," Kyle said with concern, "you should think about what she said." "Like what?" Dan asked, his anger shifting slightly. "Think about it, Dad. Your wife was suggesting that Peggy make choices that could hurt her marriage. Kyle explained. That means Denise might believe it's okay to go against commitments in some situations, which I imagine could worry you. Dan was quiet for a long time as he considered Kyle's words. His frown grew deeper as he watched his wife's surprised face. Yeah, I get what you're saying, son, Dan replied slowly. My daughter seems to follow her mother more than I'd like sometimes, he said softly, looking at Denise. I have some part to play in that, he reflected. She was the youngest and I was very busy when she was born. I just couldn't stop her mother from sharing unusual ideas with her, Dan added. Kyle noticed Denise gasp in surprise. He almost smiled. It was the first light moment he had experienced in a while. Kyle, I'm sorry for losing my temper with you, Dan said calmly. And I apologize for my outspoken wife as well. He noticed Denise take a breath as if shocked. Son, I can assure you there will be no more meddling from my wife about you and Peggy's situation, as long as she is my wife, Dan said firmly. I need to sort some things out at home, Kyle. Good luck to you. Sure, Dad, Kyle replied. Good luck to you, too. The call ended. Across town, Dan looked at his wife with a serious expression. Denise, he said firmly, how long have we been married? 34 years, Denise said cautiously. Do you want to reach 35? Dan asked, his voice steady. When Kyle got home, Peggy was unusually quiet. She had called her mother earlier and heard a brief version of the talk between Dan and Kyle. Denise had told Peggy that her father was angrier than she'd ever seen him. He had gone for a drive, telling his wife to be home when he returned. When he came back, he told Denise they needed to discuss her views on how men and women interact, her relationship with their daughter and Kyle, and especially how their marriage should move forward from here. After dinner, with the atmosphere feeling tense rather than happy, Kyle and Peggy sat in the living room, trying to support each other while being with the kids. The television was on low. Neither adult was paying much attention and wouldn't have been able to say what was showing. Once the kids were reluctantly sent to bed, the phone rang. It was Denise, apologizing to Peggy for thinking about introducing her daughter to one of the men at the Hidden Hills Club. She expressed regret, saying it was not a good idea and hoped Peggy understood that and would think again about those suggestions. Peggy was surprised and stayed quiet for most of the conversation, giving short responses. When her mother asked to talk to Kyle, Peggy handed over the phone without saying anything. Kyle spoke briefly, acknowledging Denise's admission of her mistake without adding much more. He hung up the phone without giving it back to Peggy. His mother-in-law sounded genuinely sorry, and her soft tone showed she was having a hard time expressing her feelings. She had made a choice, and Kyle wished them all the best. That's the last time, Kyle said softly. Peggy was still trying to think through her mother's words. She had never heard her mom so upset before. Her mom said she couldn't live without her husband and encouraged Peggy to make things right with Kyle before it was too late. Peggy didn't know if this was a lasting change in her mother's mind or just a reaction to what was happening now. What? Peggy asked, distracted. That's the last time I'll try to stop you from making a mistake about your future, Kyle said. I'm tired of this. He gestured to emphasize his point. You sneaking around, your plans, and your arguments about things from almost a year ago. He watched her in silence for a moment, trying to understand her thoughts. I'm not going to make a mistake, Peggy replied, showing some defiance but sounding less certain. You're misunderstanding everything, Kyle scoffed. He could tell when someone was trying to spin a situation. That's nice, Peggy, he said sarcastically. He leaned closer and lowered his voice to make her pay attention. Because if you ever do that, we are done. You understand? We are finished if you ever go out and break my trust. Peggy glared at him. You mean like you did with Anne? She challenged. Kyle shook his head. Don't even go there. You know that's not true. What happened with Anne was an accident. We didn't know what the other was really like, and we stopped as soon as we figured it out. That was a regrettable mistake, but what you're suggesting is completely different, and you know it, he said firmly. They had discussed this many times, and he was exhausted by it. Peggy shook her head. He could see she wouldn't, maybe she couldn't accept his view of the past. Well, you'd better find a way to deal with it then, Kyle told her, recognizing the stubborn look on Peggy's face. I mean it. If you betray me, you'll find yourself out the door before you know it." The look in her eyes showed she didn't trust him. The way her jaw was set made it clear she was standing her ground. He sighed and went to bed, feeling lost as he sensed trouble ahead. The distance between them lasted for months. Their closeness, which had been getting better, fell to almost nothing. Kyle got used to long waits between their moments together. To cope, he dedicated himself to ensuring his children didn't notice the strain between him and Peggy. Sometimes he succeeded, and sometimes he didn't. They were already distant, living like roommates who barely spoke. He found comfort in his little boy and girl, enjoying their love while feeling the tension from his wife. He taught Todd how to tie his shoes and helped him with his manners and social skills. Todd had learned at daycare that burping could be funny, and it took a lot of effort to show him otherwise. Mandy was going through another growth spurt. The chubby legs of a toddler were changing into those of a young girl. She was in grade school now. He had spent the winter and early spring teaching her to read words that many kids her age wouldn't understand. They would sit together for hours, sounding out words, and she would hug him tightly when she realized she could understand what she was reading. Todd didn't quite grasp what they were doing, but was eager to celebrate with his sister and dad, enjoying the warmth of their closeness. One day, Todd stood by Kyle as he sat on the couch while Mandy read from a new book. Todd started pointing out words he recognized, and their bond grew stronger. Peggy watched with jealousy, but refused to get closer to her husband to reconnect with her children. She kept drifting away, unwilling to compromise, and grew steadily more convinced that she would eventually confront Kyle about his past mistakes. Strangely, 15 months after a brief encounter with Anne, Peggy's attitude changed a lot. Their relationship got better, although it was still cooler than before. Nevertheless, it was an improvement. He reminded himself to take baby steps, to be grateful for what he had, and to seek more connection and warmth. A few weeks later, Peggy told him that a training course she had been scheduled for last year was happening again. She would be going to Orlando by herself, she added casually, for a week toward the end of July to prepare for a promotion. She worked hard to make it sound like a positive thing, giving him no reason to be concerned. Kyle felt things were changing. "How long have you known?" he asked, a bit suspicious. Peggy stepped back, her mood shifting slightly. "The news came from the office 2 days ago," she replied. She watched him closely, curious about how he would take the information. It was true. She had received the details when she said. She had been planning the training for a month, so it hadn't shocked her. "And you're going at the end of next month?" Kyle asked. Peggy nodded. "Well, it seems like you've had time to prepare," he said. He didn't ask why she hadn't told him sooner. Maybe it was because of his reaction to her last trip. That could have affected her feelings, perhaps. But there was something else in her eyes, a spark. Kyle watched her joyfully go upstairs while she pondered her outfits for the upcoming journey. She appeared so happy. He sighed, feeling tired. He didn't need to ask about the delay because he didn't worry about it anymore. After her shower, Peggy's mind was full of plans for Orlando and dreams for her and Kyle. She imagined they would reconnect after she returned. As she thought about their time together, she felt excitement building inside. Feeling a need for closeness, Peggy wrapped herself in a towel and found Kyle in the bedroom. She gently set his book aside and with a playful smile sat on his lap, her arms around his neck. "I want to spend some time with you," she said softly, with warmth in her voice. Kyle looked at her, picking up on the honesty in her eyes. He didn't completely understand the sudden wave of feelings, but felt drawn to her kindness. Peggy giggled lightly as she stood up and took his hand, leading him towards the bed. She felt relaxed and at home. They both enjoyed the fact that the kids were already asleep. Sitting at the edge of the bed, Peggy smiled at him, her eyes filled with warmth. She leaned back slightly, looking at Kyle with a playful grin. Kyle put aside his pajamas and knelt next to her. He began to share sweet moments with her, appreciating the quiet time they were having together. His gentle presence created a sense of comfort and closeness as they enjoyed each other's company. As the evening progressed, Peggy let herself feel happy and connected to Kyle. She pushed aside any other thoughts and concentrated on the love she had for him. Peggy felt overwhelmed by the strength of the moment. She noticed the emotions stirring inside her. Looking up at Kyle, she felt a deep bond and love, but knew there was something special she wanted to share with him later. She decided it would be best to wait until she was back home. Kyle stood close, their eyes meeting in a quiet understanding. Peggy gently placed her hand on his arm, showing she wanted to take their time. Feeling the need to pause, Peggy expressed her wish to slow down. Kyle, sensing her feelings, held her gently. They stayed close, enjoying the connection without rushing. Eventually, they both relaxed, content just to be together. The evening continued calmly, with both finding comfort in each other's presence, deciding to save any further plans for another time. Kyle found himself deep in thought, unsure of what to do next. Peggy sensed his uncertainty and shifted slightly, her body showing signs of tiredness. They stayed together for a while, but the closeness they had before felt distant now. As they lay there, Kyle became aware of the gap growing between them. Despite his efforts, he felt something important was missing, and this made him feel heavy. After a moment, Peggy said something that hit him hard. Kyle paused, feeling frustration rise, but chose not to respond right away. Instead, he quietly got up and walked into the bathroom, needing a moment to think. The mood in the room felt tense, reminding them both of the challenges they faced as a couple. They were left to think about what had happened, realizing that their relationship needed more than just being near each other to heal. A significant moment in their marriage had passed. While he felt anger, he also felt sadness for what had been lost. "Peggy?" he called, watching her finish her coffee. "Yeah, hon," she replied, rinsing her cup in the sink. Peggy always kept things tidy, placing the cup on the top shelf of the dishwasher with the others. "Do you remember when I overheard your mom talking to you about the Hidden Hills Club?" Peggy tensed. This was not what she wanted Kyle to think about this morning. "I remember, Kyle, but that's old news. Mom apologized and everything, it's done with." She hoped this topic would end soon. "No, that's not what I meant," Kyle said softly. "When that happened, I promised I wouldn't try to stop you from following your plans." Peggy turned to face him, curious about where he was heading with this. Her mind was at ease. She had been careful not to raise any doubts for Kyle over the past months since that incident. She felt tense. This time she hadn't done anything wrong. She simply waited for her husband to continue. "Well, I lied," Kyle said softly. Peggy blinked in surprise. That was one of the last things she expected to hear. "What?" she asked, her voice unclear. "I lied. I'm going to try one last time, Peggy," he said gently. "I know what you are planning, honey. I know about your trip to Orlando," he added. Peggy leaned back against the counter, feeling the weight of the moment. She quickly thought about everything she had said or done regarding the Orlando trip. The truth was, she hadn't mentioned anything that suggested she was doing something wrong. Suddenly, she felt offended. "Kyle, I am not planning anything. I told you that months ago." "I didn't believe you then, and I don't believe you now," Kyle said honestly. "You can't forgive me and move on. I know you too well," he added. Peggy pressed her lips together tightly. "Please, Peggy, don't do this," Kyle pleaded. "Just don't. That's all you need to do. I'll cope without affection. You don't even have to be nice to me. Just don't break up the family. Please, think of Mandy and Todd." Peggy looked at him for a long moment, appearing uncertain. She opened her mouth to respond. Whatever she intended to say was interrupted by a loud sound from outside. Her taxi had arrived. She never answered Kyle's worried request, and he didn't repeat it. She gave him a gentle goodbye and followed the driver to the bright yellow car. She waved through the window as the taxi pulled away from the curb. Kyle watched the car take a left turn at the corner and drive out of sight. Closing the door, he sighed deeply and took his phone from his belt. "Brad?" he said when he was connected. "Hey, partner," Brad replied, his tone shifting from professional to caring. Kyle was having a hard time, and there was little that could be done to help. "She just left," Kyle said. "Okay, number 42, Brad said thoughtfully. "Jimmy is already at the airport. I'll call him and get things started. Then we'll see what happens, all right?" "Yeah," Kyle said sadly. "Thanks, Brad. I'll talk to you later." "Bye," Brad said simply. There was nothing more to say. They had talked about important matters in many meetings over the past few weeks, especially after Peggy mentioned attending the training seminar. The small man was ordinary in every way. His clothes were simple, not too trendy but not so plain that they drew attention. He had an ordinary appearance, and nothing about him stood out. He walked around the luggage area almost unnoticed, looking nervous as he checked a baggage claim ticket and watched for his suitcase. He seemed like just another guy stuck in a boring office job, waiting for a routine retirement gift after years of long days. He accepted this life and had stopped trying to escape the dullness. But there was more to him than that. His name was Jimmy. He was a private investigator, and he was good at it. He had just landed in Orlando. Brad Carson, who worked with Kyle in his divorce case, had called on him. When Kyle mentioned needing proof about Peggy to help with custody issues, he thought of Jimmy right away. Brad knew the chances were low, but he believed that if there was enough evidence against Peggy, she might back off from the divorce to avoid any bad surprises. They had talked a lot about it, just two friends. Although he knew it might not be the right thing to do, some situations were more important than ethics. Kyle was a close friend to him, and Brad would do anything to help him. Jimmy was watching Peggy Whitley since she came to the airport and was still quietly observing her as she picked up her bags in Orlando. It was easy. Mrs. Whitley didn't seem to notice anyone paying attention to her. To her, Jimmy could have been just another luggage cart. Then a tall man in his 40s walked in, making a scene that got everyone's attention. After 9/11s, people paid more attention to loud noises. When they saw he wasn't a young man from the Middle East, most lost interest. A few kept watching, curious about what had happened. Jimmy kept an eye on him. He had a strong feeling about the newcomer. The man looked around until he spotted Peggy and quickly walked over. They exchanged greetings, looking a bit uncomfortable as if they weren't sure how to act. This was a close encounter with someone who wasn't her husband, something Peggy was supposed to avoid based on what the attorney had told Jimmy. He pulled out his phone from his jacket pocket and made a call. While pretending to look for his luggage, he quietly took pictures of the man and Peggy as they spoke. Over the next 10 minutes, the gap between them gradually closed. They started to show small signs of being familiar with one another. Jimmy followed them to the parking garage, struggling with 2 heavy suitcases, a laptop, and a garment bag. The duo he was watching didn't notice the regular guy trailing behind. He stopped following when they reached a dark blue Lincoln parked on the 4th level. As they passed, he secretly took a picture with a small camera hidden in his hand. The clear images could be shared with his lawyer, who was waiting for news. He got 2 good photos of Mrs. Whitley with the unknown man. The picture of the car's license plate would help him find out who the man was soon enough. Mr. Whitley had given Jimmy Peggy's reservation details, so it was easy for him to book the room next door. He only needed to leave a $100 bill peeking out from a magazine at the front desk. The magazine stayed on the counter as he walked to the elevators. After unpacking his things, he took a short break until a friend of a friend, someone he hadn't met before, knocked on his door. His backup had arrived. Jimmy could have worked alone, but he knew he would need special equipment that he couldn't carry on the plane without causing suspicion. To his surprise, his partner was a woman. Her name was Cassie, and she was skilled at her job. She had been an investigator for 3 years. As they walked to a side exit, they talked easily while getting a sturdy pole from Cassie's car. Once put together, they could extend a small camera or microphone mounted on the end as much as 18 feet over a gap, like between 2 balconies in a tall hotel, to improve their view for nighttime watching, since the camera would be too obvious during the day. Cassie had information she gathered from an unofficial license plate check about Mr. Harold Lowry, a mid-level executive at the company hosting the training seminar. While they didn't yet know how long he had known Peggy, Jimmy believed that a little digging would uncover all the needed details. Nowadays, everything seemed to leave a trail, and soon they would know everything about Mr. Lowry. Knowing that Peggy would be busy at the training event until dinner time, based on what her husband told them, they planned to start their watch when she returned to the hotel to change. Feeling at ease with each other from the beginning, the 2 private investigators took turns keeping watch for Peggy's return while the other rested. They got ready for a long evening ahead, one that promised to be demanding. Neither of them really enjoyed dealing with cases of cheating, but it was part of the job, and they wanted to help their client. Peggy Whitley felt a little annoyed that Kyle wasn't at the airport to greet her when she got back from Orlando. But as she took a taxi home, she thought maybe it was for the best. Memories from the past week kept coming to her mind, and she couldn't help but smile, wanting to keep them to herself in case Kyle noticed. For the first time in over a year and a half, Peggy felt calm inside. Since discovering Kyle's slip-up at a party, she had struggled with feelings of revenge. She had thought about how to confront Anne but hadn't found the right moment. Still, those thoughts lingered in her mind. Now, though, she felt a sense of satisfaction. Peggy smiled, realizing that her happiness wasn't just her own. The taxi driver smiled back at her. Peggy understood she needed to be careful. It would be trickier than she thought to keep this good feeling to herself. She wanted to be careful not to let anything slip. She had accomplished something important. She felt good about that. It had taken a while, but now things felt settled. Kyle had made a mistake in their marriage, and now Peggy felt she had too. A troubling thought crossed her mind. She couldn't help but wonder how her week of new experiences stacked up against her husband's betrayal. But she brushed that thought aside. She believed she had made things even and maybe even gained more. Why not? She deserved it. It had been overdue. As her worries faded, she felt joyful again. Peggy had been smart about her plan this time. She hadn't made any arrangements that anyone could find out about. Harold, the man she met in Orlando, worked nearby, and their connection had come about naturally while working. They had only met a few times for business. She reached out to him with just enough hints that she wanted to meet up when she arrived. Calling Harold from the plane felt like a clever move, and it had worked. He was waiting at the airport, almost eager to see her. The call was charged to a credit card Kyle didn't know about, set up after he had gotten upset about any expenses she made. She felt proud of herself for covering her tracks this time, and it made her chuckle. She needed to stay alert. It felt exciting. Harold might not be as talented as Kyle, but she enjoyed the thrill of trying something new. She hadn't thought about Kyle in this way for a long time, and now she was feeling a new wave of excitement. It felt freeing, and Peggy realized how alive she had felt all week. She was full of energy and hadn't felt this way in years. There were so many moments from the past week that she wanted to hold on to, like the joy she felt at the seminars, watching the people around her and wondering how many felt a similar thrill. Seeing Harold now and then during the day was a nice change. There was something exciting about sharing quick glances and the little touches when they met for lunch. She chuckled, remembering his surprised and happy expression during their night out. Those were sweet memories she could keep close and enjoy when she was by herself. She also had some pleasant moments back in her hotel room. A soft laugh slipped out, and the driver smiled at her. Peggy returned the smile, feeling content. Thursday night stood out as a special memory. Harold had encouraged her to step out onto the balcony, and it made her feel playful. They had shared a strong connection that night. She felt a rush of happiness, and it was one of the few times her achievements truly made her feel fulfilled. While she had a deeper relationship with Kyle, Harold gave her a sense of excitement. She wished Harold had paid more attention to her. She thought she might have made a different choice about who to share those moments with. There was a guy from her seminar, the one from Arizona. Randy. That was his name. He had caught her attention. He looked great in his suit. She wondered what it would be like to share a moment with someone like him. That confident smile he had shown at the first gathering certainly left an impression. Suddenly, Peggy knew this wouldn't be the last time she felt this way. She thought about it carefully. Kyle wouldn't need to find out. She would make sure of that. If he didn't know, it wouldn't hurt him. She let the idea sit for a while longer. She would be very cautious. She wouldn't plan out meetings in detail. It would have to be someone like Randy, someone she met by chance while away. Yes, spontaneous moments, somewhere Kyle would never go. He wouldn't suspect a thing since she would keep everything hidden. She decided against having a long-term relationship. Those were too complicated, and she didn't want to involve herself with another man. Kyle was more than enough for her. Peggy shifted a bit in her seat in the back of the taxi. It felt nice. Some of the excitement passed through her, and she felt happy again. It felt a bit daring, and she loved the rush of it. Suddenly, she started to think about her next trip and who she might meet there for some fun. It was all light-hearted and not serious. She imagined who that person might be, wondering what they looked like and how they would act. Her phone rang. "Hello," she answered brightly. "Mrs. Whitley, this is Sam McMillan." "Hi, Sam. How are you today?" Peggy didn't really like her boss, but she tried to be friendly. "Doing well," Mr. McMillan said. He didn't ask about her day. "I'll get straight to the point, Mrs. Whitley," he continued with a hint of humor. "Okay," Peggy replied, intrigued. "I need to let you know that your job at Bruckmeister & Son is ending, Mr. Bruckmeister Jr. wants you to come to the office on Monday between 9 o'clock and noon to pick up your severance check and clear out your desk. Any questions can be answered then." Shocked, Peggy was quiet. The taxi driver noticed her change in expression, feeling the shift in the air. He hoped this ride wouldn't become too difficult. I don't understand," Peggy finally said. "Why?" "I'm not sure, Mrs. Whitley," Mr. McMillan answered sincerely. His tone told Peggy he likely didn't have the answers. Taking a deep breath, she prepared herself to reply. "All right," she said firmly. "I'll just wait until Monday. Thank you for calling." She ended the call, feeling a bit more in control. When she got home, Peggy noticed her husband Kyle's truck wasn't in the driveway, which made her feel frustrated. He should be here. She could really use his support. He wouldn't dwell on the details. He would just be there for her. As she walked through the front door, a nagging feeling grew that something else was wrong. The grandfather clock that had been in the foyer since they bought the house was gone. The umbrella stand in the corner was missing too. When she stepped into the living room, it was bare apart from a few bits of brown wrapping paper scattered around. The house was silent. A chill ran down her spine. It felt deserted, empty. Her phone rang again. She glanced at the screen. It was Kyle. "Kyle!" she said sharply. "Where are you? Where's all the furniture? What's happening?" Her voice rose with her emotions. She was angry, hurt, and a bit scared. She couldn't understand what was going on. "I won't tell you where I am, Peggy," Kyle said calmly. He sounded tired, almost too exhausted to talk. He was weighed down by a deep sense of tiredness. It was partly physical. Packing up a whole house filled with furniture and personal things had been tiring. Telling the kids about the move had gone better than he expected, but he felt a lot of worry inside. He had been dreading this talk with Peggy, but he thought it was important. He hadn't slept much since hearing some upsetting news about Peggy while she was in Orlando. The situation troubled him, and he felt he needed to clear the air. When a friend of Brad's called to say that Peggy was back home, he immediately called her. He couldn't wait any longer. He needed to get this over with. Maybe, if he spoke his mind, he could find some relief. "What? Why won't you tell me where you are?" Peggy asked, sounding upset. "I didn't say I couldn't, Peg," Kyle replied calmly. "I said I wouldn't." "Kyle Whitley, what do you think you're doing? You better tell me what's going on, or I'm going to—" "Going to what, Peggy?" Kyle interrupted. "Haven't you understood yet? I told you if you ever betrayed me because of that misunderstanding about my loyalty, I said I'd leave you, Peggy. And I have." Peggy was taken aback, shocked by his words. "Kyle," she said quietly, "I haven't—" "Stop right there, Peggy," Kyle said firmly. "You can see why I left. What else is there to say?" "What? See what? I don't understand," Peggy argued, feeling confused. "Have you been in the den?" Kyle asked. "No." "Go there," he instructed. With a heavy heart, Peggy walked down the hallway to the room they had changed into a study. When she got there, the truth hit her. A large old photograph was sitting on the mantel above the fireplace. Even though it was faded, it clearly showed her with someone else on a balcony, looking very close. Peggy froze, unable to stand any longer. She sat on the floor, her legs tucked beneath her as she stared at the photo, realizing it meant the end of everything. "Kyle," she said softly, her voice shaky. "Don't say anything, Peggy," Kyle replied. "Now you see? Now you understand why the house is empty. Now you know why the kids and I aren't there." "Where are my children?" she cried. "You can't take them from me." Her voice trembled with fear. "Calm down, Peggy," he said gently. "I have already taken them away. Though you might say it was because of choices you made. It's done. You'll have to accept it, so pull yourself together and I'll explain what happens next." He knew she would be upset about the kids, and he needed to get to the next part. "Mandy and Todd are okay, Peggy," he reassured her. "Actually, they're doing better than I am," he confessed. "They have accepted that they will be living with me now, and that you won't be around anymore. You've been keeping your distance for a while, and they didn't react to the change as strongly as you might think." "No!" Peggy cried out. "You can't do this!" "I already have," Kyle said calmly. "Now please sit down and hear me out." He paused for a moment. "Are you ready?" he asked. "Don't I get a say in this?" Peggy asked, her voice filled with hurt. "No, you don't," Kyle replied firmly. "For the first time, Peggy, you must face the results of your choices, what you've done to yourself, your husband and children, and your marriage." He took a deep breath. "It's unfortunate, Peggy," he spoke gently. "If you hadn't been so focused on seeking revenge, we might have resolved this together. I was open to compromise, but you chose a different direction. You seemed fixated on getting back at me." "For what?" "Anne made a choice one night, thinking it was linked to her husband, only to learn otherwise. When she found out the truth, she quickly stepped back. But you spent a year and a half planning and looking for ways to be with someone else. And you succeeded. I have proof of your interactions with your friend Harold that crossed boundaries. You let everything unfold where others could see, Peggy. What were you thinking, allowing it to go that far? I've recorded everything from start to finish." Kyle took a moment, trying to stay calm. He had promised himself not to get angry, but he felt frustration rising. "Did you really believe I wouldn't notice what you were doing, Peggy?" he said quietly. "You seemed so enthusiastic these past few weeks. It was clear something was happening. Your actions made it obvious you were determined to get back at me. And did you forget that credit card companies regularly send out offers? You had bills sent to a post office box hoping I wouldn't catch on, but they also send things to the main address on the account. I found out about that new credit card almost immediately after you got it." He paused for a moment. "Kyle," Peggy spoke softly, I made a mistake. Everything has fallen apart. I don't even know why I lost my job today. I realize I've hurt you, and I'm sorry." "Peggy, you shouldn't speak to me like that. You don't have the right after everything that's occurred," Kyle said. He took a moment before continuing. "I'll agree with you on one point. You made some unfortunate choices," he admitted. "I tried to tell you to move on from this obsession with revenge. I tried many times, but you wouldn't listen," he said with bitterness. "You insisted on doing things your way. And the reason you're facing these outcomes is right there on the mantel," he added. "I sent Mr. Bruckmeister shared a photo that conveyed a strong message. He and I both feel the same way about employees who lie to their partners and misuse work trips for their own benefit. The official reason may be different, but you were let go because trust is gone, just as I don't trust you anymore." Peggy struggled to process what Kyle was saying. It felt like too much at once. She chose to put her job worries aside for now. Her marriage mattered more. "Kyle," she said softly, "you wanted me to forgive you when you were with Anne. Can't we fix this? I'll do whatever it takes. Please forgive me. I'm truly sorry." Tears fell from her eyes. "Forgive? There's nothing to forgive, Peggy," Kyle replied clearly. "You've worn me down. There's no love left for you anymore." Peggy started to cry harder. Kyle's tired voice felt so final. She felt a chill in the room where they had shared many happy moments. "Don't you love me at all?" she gasped. "Yes, I do. A little," Kyle said honestly. "But love doesn't just disappear suddenly." "But I'll learn," he added firmly. "It's hard, but I will learn to stop loving you. This has been building for quite some time. I'm tired of how you've tried to control me and everything around you, just so you wouldn't have to show more of yourself." "I think your mother has influenced this," Kyle said thoughtfully. "Since Mandy was born, and especially with Todd, I have felt a distance. It seems like you think all you've owed me are children, and after that your love faded. I can't grasp why, but it feels like you've been holding back your feelings for years." "Kyle, that's not true," Peggy said sadly. "I've loved you since our first day at school. I can't picture my life without you." "Well, you might have to," Kyle said firmly. I'm not sure how things became this way, but after the issue with the dress, it feels like our marriage has been a fight for control. Even that incident turned into a competition. You had to win, even if it meant being dishonest with me. I really think your mother played a part, he continued. She didn't agree with my feelings about the dress, but that wasn't the only topic we disagreed on. She's voiced her opinions often, and it's been hard for me. You feel like you have to win every argument because you're a woman, and I'm a man, Kyle said quietly. He paused for a moment. Anyway, he continued, I'm really tired. I'm sorry for talking about things that don't really matter anymore, he said to her. Let me get back to the kids, Peggy, he said with a firm tone. First of all, I'm not in Texas anymore. I'm going to be working in another state for a while, and I can't share that right now. Maybe later. The TV stations can manage things without me for a bit. I've made sure everything is organized there. Brad has the authority to handle things while I'm away. Oh, and don't ask about me at my office because they don't know where I'll be either. The kids are doing well. They've been having a great time sitting high up in the cab of this big rental truck I'm driving and playing games. Every time we stop, they think it's amazing to have a swimming pool and a room where they don't have to clean up after themselves. So don't worry about them, Peggy. I miss them, Peggy said, her voice heavy with sadness. And they will miss you too, Kyle replied gently, even though you've kept your distance from them this past year. But some things just have to happen. I'll fight you for them, Peggy said boldly. You can't keep my children from me. Well, that leads us to the next important thing, Kyle said seriously, taking a deep breath that Peggy could hear through the phone. I'm going to say this only once, Peggy. I'm filing for a divorce. I believe you should get half of what we've built together, except for the trust fund my father left for me. That means the house, the cars, our accounts, and the debts, too, all split evenly. That's a fair offer, Peggy. I could probably ask for more. Here's the deal. If you fight against the divorce, I will make sure that everything about your actions this past year comes to light. Do you understand, Peggy? He was quiet for a long moment. It felt extreme to him, but he knew he had to make a choice. He had lost respect for his wife and didn't feel he owed her any kindness or understanding. He would do what he needed to get what he wanted from her. He would deal with the choices he was making, right or wrong. Peggy cried until her eyes were sore from wiping them. You're a heartless man, she finally said, her voice shaking. I never knew you could be like this. I didn't realize you could break our trust so easily, Peggy, he replied sharply. Heartless? I learned that from you. So I guess that's one more thing I can thank you for. He paused, waiting for a response, but all he heard was her quiet sobbing. Anyway, listen, he said, about visitation. This is how it's going to be, Peggy. I will not keep the kids away from you any longer than necessary. I won't hurt them like that. I really think you should visit the doctor for a health check as soon as you can, Peggy. I was shocked when I saw those pictures of you with that man without taking any precautions. What were you thinking? Did you think about how this could affect our family? He claimed he didn't have any problems, Peggy replied weakly. She hadn't considered the possible fallout. Of course he said that, Kyle replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. What else would he say? But he also assured his own family that he was busy with work. They had no idea what he was doing. There was no truth there. How does it feel to cause so much pain, Peggy? He asked quietly. Oh, no. What have you done? What do you think I've done, Peggy? Did you think I would just ignore this? You wore your wedding ring all week. It's in every photo of you and him. He knew you were with someone else. The last thing I would do is let someone disrespect our marriage. Not a chance. His wife actually appreciated what we did, Peggy. From what I've heard, she was thankful that we brought the truth to light. She found out he was unfaithful with someone else not long ago. That person was dealing with serious problems, according to Mrs. Lowry. Kyle let out a hollow laugh. There was no joy in it. Actually, he said quietly, she's the one who has been pushing for safety measures. She's worried about what he might have caught. Peggy was at a loss for words. The tears stopped as she thought about what Kyle was saying about Harold. An uneasy feeling settled in her stomach. She felt sick. She was worried about her future because of her choices. She isn't going to stick around while her husband is with someone else, Kyle continued. She's moving on and making sure she gets what she wants, he said, sounding satisfied. Peggy couldn't say anything. The lump in her throat made it hard to speak. "Anyway," he said after a moment, "I won't let you be around the kids if you might have been exposed to any health risks. I don't care about being polite when it comes to my children. Simply put, Peggy, you will not be around them until I receive a doctor's approval. Is that clear?" She nodded, though she knew she needed to respond. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice growing weaker. "Good," he said. "That's good. If you don't fight the divorce, and once I have the health reports, Peggy, I will make sure you can see the kids as much as you like." "No, wait. Let me clarify something. Health issues can appear months after exposure. Doc Miles said it might take 6 months. If, in 6 months, I get a report that says you're okay, then we can move forward. I don't trust you, Peggy. That trust is gone, along with respect and love. You'll need to come to where we are to see them, and I'll always be nearby to watch. This is your problem. You brought this on yourself, and I won't feel bad for you." "Kyle," she whispered. "What is it, Peggy?" "I'm sorry," she murmured. "Yeah, me too," he replied. Suddenly, there was nothing more to say. "Well, that's it for now," he said. "I'll call occasionally. You can always reach me through Brad's office." He was quiet for a long time. "Goodbye," he said softly. "Goodbye," she echoed. Kyle hung up before she could add anything else. "Hello? Peggy?" her mother asked sharply. "Why didn't you call me when you got home?" "Mom, everything is a mess," Peggy said. Her voice shook, but she got it all out. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" her mother asked, worried. "What has Kyle done now?" "It's not just what Kyle did," Peggy replied. "Well, it is, but there's more." "What, honey? Tell me." "Mom, Kyle is divorcing me," Peggy said, letting the hurt flow out for the first time. "What?" Denise exclaimed. "Who does he think he is? Don't worry, we'll make sure he pays for this," she promised. "Mom," Peggy said cautiously. She took a deep breath. It was time to tell her. "I was involved with someone in Orlando, and Kyle has proof of it." Her mother paused. "That doesn't matter, honey. We'll get through this," Denise finally said. "Mom," Peggy insisted. "You don't get it. I was trying to get back at Kyle for what happened at that party, and now he's left me. He won't let me see the kids until I see the doctor," she said quietly. "He can't do that," Denise replied loudly. "Mom, I told you." "He has proof of everything," Peggy stressed. "If I fight him for the kids, he'll make those things public. Do you want to see your daughter in that situation? I didn't think so. He has me in a hard place, and I can't do anything. I don't even know where he is." Denise was silent for a long moment. "I thought I was clever," Peggy went on sadly. "I wanted to get back at him for what he did with Anne. I wouldn't listen. I was too caught up in my anger to see it was a mistake. And now, I've lost him." "Well," her mother said carefully, "I don't think you were wrong, honey. Kyle should have understood your hurt. If he was a good husband, he wouldn't have missed that. Sweetheart, your dad and I will do everything we can to help you. We promise," she said. Peggy pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at it in shock for a moment. "Mom," she finally said, "why don't you just give it a rest?" She pressed the off button. Feeling alone, the woman tossed the phone across the room. She sat on the floor and stared out the patio door, lost in thought about how her life had completely changed. Hey listeners, if you enjoyed watching this video and want to stay updated with our latest content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss out on what's coming next. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video with Queen Cheating Tales.